Okay, do you want to say something about this work before we go to... Yeah. Would you want to read out?
Like we were talking earlier, there are hundreds of translations of Meghadutam. And a lot of translation, particularly of Sanskrit texts, have been approached from a very academic perspective, to read all the commentaries, to understand all the nuances of the word, the interpretations that different commentators have, which is all, well, very important, which I did and enjoy doing. And Amukta Malida was more like that, lots of notes, lots of explanatory things. But in this one, I really wanted to focus on really getting at something poetic in English, that someone could sit with no real understanding of the Indian poetic tradition and feel something and have that kind of visceral experience of reading them. So that was the main focus in this particular version, and why I feel like it's different than other versions.
You want to read a couple of lines from them?
I'll read you one. I'll read the original Sanskrit first. One beautiful thing about Meghadutam is that it was written 1500 years ago, and there are still so many places in the text that you can go and see and still visit and experience in very much the same way that he described. And we're not 100% sure, but it seems that Kalidasa was based in Ujjaini. And many of the poems, there's a good 6-7 poems, particularly about Ujjaini and the temples around that area, what city life was like there. So this is one poem about Ujjaini that's quite beautiful. So I'll read it in the Sanskrit and then I'll read you the translation. Prapya vantin udayana kada kovida gramya vriddan purvo drishta upasarapurim sri vilasam vilasam swalpi bhute sucharit phale swarginam gam gatanam seshaihi punarai kritameva divaha kantim kandamekam. So this is basically a description of what Ujjain is in his mind, what it represents. So here's the translation. So the cloud is traveling to all these places. The cloud is just arriving in Avanti. Arriving in Avanti, where elders still recall the stories of Prince Udayana, approach the place I spoke of once before, that noble city of Ujjaini, a hallowed piece of heaven, borne down by the last shares of merit of those returning to earth after the fruit of their good deeds had run low. Do you have that one? Can we hear it?
Yeah, thank you so much. Would you want to?
No.
Okay. Thank you for the privilege of listening to this straight out of the press, so to speak.
So, but that also gets at what you were asking. I mean, I really believe, and I wrote it so that people would read it aloud and feel that rhythm. But as you said, when you read them internally, you have that too. But there is a quality that comes out when you speak that's special, and it creates a space, because then there's a hearer, there's a listener, there's someone there. There's that bond that's created. It's like all of you were just listening. That changed the experience for me, and hopefully it was something special for you to hear it read aloud.
Yeah, thank you. Let me now introduce Subashree Krishnaswamy. She teaches at Asian College of Journalism, but has translated and contributed to anthologies of short stories and poetry from Tamil, translated to English. She's a translator of the Tamil story, edited by Dilip Kumar, published in 2016. A big 572-page collection spanning 9 decades from, 1913 to 2000. Subashree, it's wonderful to see this labor of love spanning, 9 decades of the Tamil story. Would you see this as a cultural history in some ways, this text that you have put together of short fiction? Would you see this as some kind of a cultural history of the Tamil context itself? It must have been very interesting to put together a translation which has women writers, little known, prior to this effort. So how would you, now looking back at the translation that you've put together, how would you see this work? Is it a kind of a cultural history of Tamil?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I have called it in my translator's note, cultural history of sorts, because, from the 1913 to 2000, if you trace something, it's not only the language that you trace, it's also the culture. And you can see how, the Tamil psyche and ethos is really represented in this collection. So you see from the early stories, and the early stories had this nationalistic fervor. And then you see after that the young India, and after that cynicism setting in. Then you had the Dravidian movements coming in, the communism. There's so many things right up till the really powerful Dalit voices. So it really traces, it is an evolution of the Tamil short story, but it also traces the Tamil society. And
earlier when we were talking, you were, telling me about some of the ways in which the strategies that you were adopting while translating the short stories. As a translator, if you can reflect on your own practice of translation, both in this particular context as well as, the poems that you have translated, would you want to share that experience as a translator with all of us?
Yeah, as translators, we take, several positions. But the main thing for me was to really, not to fail these wonderful, wonderful authors. So when I read every story, I really soaked it in and internalized it. And the translations almost instinctively work themselves out. But of course, there are certain decisions that you take. Like yesterday, I was saying that for dialogues, I really, gave English as it is spoken in Tamil Nadu a free rein. But I was very, very careful with descriptive passages. I kept to a formal thing. But the thing is to capture whatever the writer intended. So to get the right note. So if it is irony, you have to capture that. If it is humor, it has to come through. If it is pathos, it has to come through. So you work these things out, and I think, I hope so, since they think that it's going for a reprint, so I hope I have captured all that.
I have two very general questions. Maybe all of you can respond to these questions. When one is recontextualizing many of these texts for a different kind of readership and audience, what are the elements that, as a translator, you worry about? Do you worry, for instance, about whether something will be acceptable for this readership? Do you worry about whether it might become controversial? Do you worry about how you want your text to be read and approached by the audience for whom it is intended? Are you at all keeping any of these aspects in mind? Also, another question that I was briefly discussing with you: do you talk to your publishers about paratextual elements, the cover page, how that should appear, how your text is going to be pitched for readers? Are these decisions that, as a translator you come in on, or is it something that you don't worry too much about? You've done the translation, you have rendered the author in the best way you thought possible, so you don't really worry about the context. Can you, tell all of us a little bit about this aspect, the reception side of it? Any one of you, all of you could respond.
As far as the editing and all that goes with this book, I was an editor in a publishing house, and I edited a review magazine for a number of years. So this book is actually, they threw everything on my head. So, from beginning to end, I've been really, really involved. So with the cover, so they just had it, we did it in Chennai actually, because I was there, and I've done so many books earlier. So in fact, we had to find people. They said, "Do you think it has to be read?" I mean, I can't be objective about my own writing. So, and then the cover, and the designer is a very good friend who I've worked with for several years on several books. So, and then the cover, the painting, which was also, we found the artist, who's a very, very fine artist, and he happily gave the cover, and he just wanted to know, will they give me one book, you think? And, he didn't even charge. So the whole thing was, I've been involved in every step. So from designing the pages to, doing the cover and the editing and the proofing, so everything I've been involved because I have been an editor. So that maybe they'll have different
I was also very clear from the beginning that I wanted to be involved with the cover, with the layout of the poems on the page. I mean, especially with money stuff, I mean, it's really, visual. But for me, even the way that the text is laid out in this one, it's very clean, one poem per page. I was very strict about that. But in terms of what you were asking in terms of, do I think about the audience? It's like in music, I'm a musician, and generally I don't think about the audience. I think about the rag, or I think about Kalidasa, and that's really it, and my relationship to the text. And my feeling is that I just want to share that beauty in whatever standard that I feel is best. How people interpret it is up to them. What has changed maybe over the years with my translations is sometimes I wanted to add more notes so people could understand things, to contextualize things, explain certain small nuances of the poetic tradition or some alankara that you might not get. But in this Meghadutam, there's no notes. So I feel it's all there for you to read as it is. If you want to know more, you can go and find out more. But really, they're just poems. And however people want to read them, it's their will and wish.
Mine is a little bit different compared to both of them. In fact, I would say my ex-professional background was in media and marketing. I used to work in advertising and then looked after graphic design. And for those reasons, I decided not to have nothing to do with it, to not interfere in it, and to really not be bothered with it, because whoever is doing it knows what they're doing. I restricted myself to the inside of the book, and I had no input at all on the covers. I mean, they did send me the 3 covers, and I gave some opinion, and I don't know what happened to that after that. In fact, even the title Kalidasa for the 21st century is not my title. That was part of the Aleph line of classics series that they decided to launch in order to backlist them. And I looked at the title and I thought, well, that's a little bit gimmicky, and I don't know if I really think it makes a lot of, I will say, sense. But then I thought, I'm sure they know what they're doing, and this is going to be pitched into that slot, and that's fine with me. However, absolutely, as far as the lineation is concerned, you have seen my work. It's, the marginal spaces are very important for vertical reading, for horizontal reading, and the spatial dynamics of the page. That was reproduced exactly to the kerning and the character spaces as I had it. I had no input on the marketing. As far as the audience is concerned, actually, especially with the Gita, I've had a lot of feedback from readers. Not sort of like in reviews and things. People will just email me, and sometimes they've been just so valuable. I cannot tell you how grateful I am to readers. With the Gita, actually, one point which I took on 2 or 3 points. One major point was that in my first edition, I had S/HE, she, to represent the he and the she. But although that was kind of something I was not very comfortable with. My very first translation was just she, instead of he, because she includes the he anyway, and besides, I would call myself she, and as I told you, my whole thought was to put myself in the shoes of Arjuna. So in that process, she was what came out. And then the very first version had S stroke he, which was not very good. I had feedback about that, and a lot of people told me that's sort of interfering with the rhythm of it, because it's such an oral kind of translation. You can literally read it, just perform it. I changed it, and now in this edition, which is this one, it has just SHE everywhere instead of he. So I took that point on board. The other small points, like caste, for example, which is such a problematic term, and I had used varna, and I was playing with this and playing with that and trying to figure out how to say it. I've made a couple of revisions in this edition, taking readers' feedback on board, and this is not just like casual one-off lines. These are discussions I've had from readers who I did not know before, who would just email me and get into a discussion. And really, I'm very grateful to that. Absolutely, I would say readers are a part of this.
I read many authors across from different languages. Of course, reading English only because of translation. One thing I find very funny is that when it comes to serious literature, I think the translation comes out more easily. I think when it falls flat when it comes to humor, is it because humor is a bit difficult to translate, which is what I feel. Because when I read about a humorous book, say written in French, translated in English, I think somehow it doesn't come out as humorously as it expected to be. So as translators, do you feel that humor is a easier one to translate or serious prose to translate? I think that's Subashree can answer it better because she's done a range of these.
Yeah. Please read this book. The humors really come out well, I think. Okay? So that'll... no, I think, as you say, humor is one of the most difficult things. It's very subtle, and you really have to get the right note. So it is a little more difficult, and I hope I have pulled it off. And I don't know which translations you mean, because there have been some writers who really translated humor very finely as well.
I think humor is there very much in this distinction you make between a high and a low, or maybe a classical and something else. I'm not so sure of that distinction.
Even between
oh, it's difficult. Yeah,
I'm saying that taken as serious text.
Serious.
Versus a humorous.
So I would love
because
to
there's a context that's there involved in that.
I'd love to use the opportunity of your question to show you one or two funny things in a very serious text. There are many funny moments in the Gita as well, but it's not communicated sometimes because it's not sort of embraced. For example, when Krishna says to Arjuna, Ashocyan anvashochastvam pragnavadamscha bhashase, a lot of translations actually say, you speak wise words, Arjuna. But he's not saying that. He's saying the opposite. He's saying you're not speaking wise words. Right? He's saying the opposite. It's like a cynical remark, and it's humorous. So in my translation, after Arjuna talks and when Krishna starts to talk, I open with, nice speech, Arjuna, but the truly wise know better than to be sad over life that's gone or not. So I think humor, you can put it in serious literature. It's absolutely there. And you can include it within a context of a lot of gravitas as well, and it's part of all the rasas.
Which is easier, humor or serious? Just one
actually, if you internalize the text really well and you've soaked it all in, I think you can do anything. So, the humor will come out, and the pathos, if there is, the irony, whatever the author intended, will come out if you really internalize this text. And you've soaked it in, and you've really thought through it, and really digested it well.
What is the global reception beyond the Indian context of such translations?
So I feel Kalidasa is fairly well known and scholastically well studied, maybe overstudied. So there's been a good amount of interest in that. Telugu, of course, is not well studied, especially the classical stuff. So there hasn't been that much interest in Amuk Mayur, I would say. Even in India, to be quite frank. I mean, the funny thing about translation is Telugu speakers can only access, many Telugu speakers can only access a Granthika kind of text like this through an English translation. And even that is not being done. So this stuff is quite rare amongst you know, a general readership. But people who have had interest, I think, have gotten into it. But definitely Kalidasa is much more of a hit maker than Krishnadeva.
This book, I really don't know who'll, yeah, but the thing is, I wanted other Indians to read it first because, you know, with all our wonderful languages, we really have wonderful, wonderful writing in our languages. And I read something from the Bengali or Telugu because I want to get the cadences of Bengali or Tamil. And I hope the fragrance of Tamil has come through in this and people do enjoy it. And if it goes abroad and others enjoy it, I'm really happy. But yeah.
I guess because both of my books are well known, you know, it's a retranslation with lots of translations before it, so it sort of falls within the Gita tradition and within the Kalidasa tradition. My Gita was has been taught at University of Iowa, UNLV, Boston, California Institute of the Arts as well, I think. But very interestingly, it's been taught either in translation studies courses or in world literature type of courses, where for them it's a sampler of what represents another culture or so on. Whereas I find that Indian readers in general, because the majority of the people who seem to read it for a rediscovery of the relish of the Gita, seem to be reading it for the content, and then they are so surprised when they discover that, hey, it's a poem, you know. I mean, look at the literary qualities. And then, you know, when they look at it, if they go back to the Sanskrit, some of them have written to me, you're right, na sato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate sat. I never realized that was so beautiful sounding, and your English actually takes me back to the Sanskrit, and for me that's a compliment to go back to the source text.
Actually, this book actually has been picked up by a lot of Tamils who actually, you know, have the Tamil sensibility. They can speak the language, they can't read in Tamil. So that's a new set of readership we translators find in our various Indian languages. Yeah.
I'm going to ask Subashree to indulge us. I have very delightful memories from our past of her completely funny impersonation of Tamil English. Are there examples you can read out from your translations which capture that English?
There are, actually I read out yesterday.
Just one small example.
I'll just read the last page of that milk thing, okay? I'll just continue with that. And I hope that's what you're looking for. And so they are just, you know, just to tell Rita that, you know, husband and wife, they are discussing the milk account. Her husband wants to settle the milk account. And she says she knows it all and you don't have to write it down. Now he keeps telling her, why don't you write it down? So this is the conversation. And it's actually very funny. But the entire life unfolds through this very funny story. And, for the person who asked about humor, please tell me if it worked, okay? Yeah. So they're talking about the buffalo milk, I think, now. So there are 5.5 arak. You know, the arak is a measure, and in English it used to be written as oloks, so I'm going to call it oloks, okay? There are 5.5 oloks above. Deduct from that. How can you deduct from that? That is cow's milk. This is buffalo's milk. See how she buys milk? She buys milk, it seems, milk. Why are you getting so angry? If you want me to buy milk, if you don't want me to buy milk, I'll stop it. As if I'm buying milk only for myself. Who said not to buy milk? Can't you write down how much you buy? What is there to write? What is there if you write or tell it through your mouth? Everything is calculation only. As if the account is going to run away. It won't run away anywhere. Now tell me the accounts from the 14th. How many days did Chellamal and her husband stay with us? 5 days or 6 days? When they stayed, we bought quarter pali extra milk, buffalo milk in the morning, and 1.5 olok cow's milk extra in the evening. For how many days? For how many ever days they stayed? No, just see. Yes, I'll see and I'll be damned. And when Kunchu was sick, for kanji, curd and all, I bought an extra olok every day. He had fever for 4 days, no. And then We went out of town for 3 days. We didn't buy them. And when we returned only in the evening on the third day, isn't it? I had instructed Mangalam well before. We will be back in the evening, so get milk and keep. She had bought 3/4 padi milk. How much is all that? Just calculate and see. Yes, I will see and be reduced to rack and ruin. Wonder if that milkman has kept accounts. Of course he would have. But just because he keeps, we need calculate or what? We should just give whatever he asks? No, we'll pay him according to our calculations only. But first, let us tally our accounts. What tally? What I told you only is the account. Yes, your account only. I don't have any time now. There's an accountant in my office. Very clever with calculations. I'll bring him in the evening when I come home. We'll check the accounts then. I then left for the office.
Who's the one author or a poet that you've read who hasn't been translated but you would like to, regardless of the marketing?
Actually, not like a poet or author. Last night I received a copy of a Telugu book written by my grandmother in the early 20th century, and that is the next thing that I want to work on. Not yet, please. Yeah.
What are the challenges a translator faces when he translates fiction, especially novels, like crime fiction, thriller fiction, not classics but contemporary fiction? We have the Krishna Ki by Ashwin Singh translated into Telugu, Tamil, etc. So, what are the challenges a translator faces when he translates fiction, especially novels?
The challenges are the same for any text, I would understand, because whatever the author intended, you want to capture that, right? And the main thing is I only translate if I really enjoy a story, and because I enjoyed it so much, I want to share it to people who can't access it in the language. So and then there are lots of strategies we use while translating. I think that will require another session, because what to do with kinship terms, what to do with our forms of address, and we take all this into consideration. How do you write the dialogues? How do you write the formal English? Now, do you want the cadences of the original language to come through? So these are all decisions that we take as translators. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I have a question for all the three panelists. So let me know, once you do a translation work, it is important you must take permission from the original owner. Is it necessary? Suppose if you don't find the owner, and after translating the work, if you find the owner, what will be the consequences? The first question. The next is what are the with regard to the language, what are the difficulties you face in translating? For advanced writing, I just wanted to know. And the first question, suppose if you don't take the permission, it amounts to stealing of knowledge. You can be prosecuted for it.
When we translated this book, we took permission from everybody. And Dilip Kumar, the editor of this, is a writer himself. He knows all the Tamil writers. And even if they were dead, he found out if any of his children, hold the copyright. And we really traced everyone for everyone, and we paid everyone. I don't think you can just take somebody's work and just translate and not tell them. That's really not on. And I don't think any good publisher does that. Because the first thing the publisher will ask is, how can we get the copyright? So no publisher actually publishes without getting the copyright.
But the Kalidasa work and the Ramayana, you find abundant, written by other,
it's only
other writers.
The copyright law there is.
That's in the public domain, because once it crosses a certain 70 years or something, then it enters the public domain and you can use that. But if it is not in the public domain, then you should have permission.
But this is an interesting question, because it's not like the Ramayana was not translated many times before, in ancient times or medieval times, or Bharatam or Bhagavatam, right? So I think there's a different Indian sense about copyright in general, that if a Kalidasa or a Vyasa wrote whatever, that there was almost not a restriction, but almost an invitation to rewrite these things, because that actually shows the greatness of the original text. It's actually honoring that original text. So I think the whole copyright thing, obviously, if I found Krishnadevaraya Kalidasa, I'd be most happy and to take their permission.
But also, once it becomes commercial, the point is I don't think you can justify it with an Indian sensibility, because obviously the person gets a percentage of whatever the income is. And I don't think there's a joke about how in some places, China, India, etc., copyright becomes the right to copy. And that's not the reality today. We are in a worldwide, laws of protection, copyright protection, etc. exist, and we do have to honor that.
Yeah, I just want to ask the panel, between the three of you, I guess you represent at least two facets of what contemporary translation for Indian literatures consists of, right? So there is the classical, the Bhakti traditions, and then there is the more contemporary modern literatures, and it's really heartening to see a lot of really good translations for for all of these literatures come out. But I want to ask the panel, what do you see as the meeting ground between these different sets of translations that are happening in the contemporary moment? And if you could just comment on that from your experiences doing the translations you've done.
You're asking what we find is the kind of connectiveness between all of this new translation that's going on? Yeah. So I think one of the main things which we touched upon before is this is giving access.
Can I just rephrase that?
Yeah.
I think the way I understood it is that if there are completely different readers, some readers reading only contemporary literature, some readers reading only classical literature, some readers reading only Bhakti literatures, is there something that can bring these different sets of readers together? That's not your question. Okay. And whatever you have.
Okay, so now there's two questions on the table. So I'll say one thing about this. One thing, as we touched on before, I think whatever it is, be it old, medieval, new, whatever, it's giving access not only to the world, but really Indians to get in touch with their own literature, regional or in their own language, that they just are not in touch with. And that is a really exciting thing. For people, we have to know ourselves. And given our colonial history, whatever happened in our life as a people, it happens that a lot of it has to go through English now to reach those things. Of course, there is a lot to be said about translations going back into Indian languages, which are also dying out, that we need to do. So I think that is one of the things that I think connects us all. What Vijay was asking, I think that's where the issue of good translation comes in. Like the classical stuff was always in a very stilted language. It was classical text, so it's very, high and ornate and unapproachable. But we all want to make it approachable. We want to make it to say that it might have been 1,500 years ago, but the issues, the feelings, the emotions are all understand what's being said there. And I think making them fresh in terms of the language that we use, so that it speaks to a modern person, is all you really need to do. And making that the goal of translating some of the older stuff.
He's answered it really well. I would like to add on to that. Now, when you read Eliot, for example, and you might read about the fog in London, if you haven't experienced the fog in London, it's not as evocative for you as when you read Kalidasa. He talks about a garland in the sky of storks moving, and you immediately, and he talks about how a garland without posts on a door, you've seen it in your environment, and you immediately sort of respond to it, and it's almost like a self-awareness increases. And for me, the reason I'm attracted to classical Indian sources is because it's not so homogenized. You sort of get a more distinct idea of who we are in that, and that's what attracts me to it. And I'm sure different people will find different things in it, but for me that's the evocative nature of it.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think anything that you read, it has to resonate with you. and that's the most important thing. And why should any reader just read contemporary stuff? I mean, I'm just waiting to read their books. So I think a reader dips into different things, depending on what you want to read at that time. And to answer Vijay's question, you'll have to invite the three of us again next year, the HLF, on a panel, so we can answer it. Yeah.
Good. Nice job.
Yeah. My own response to your question would be English is the common meeting ground probably, because English is constantly recasting many of these texts for readers with a variety of interests, whether they are academic readers reading these texts for academic purposes, using them as source texts for their research, or general readers who want to read it because they have lost familiarity with these texts in their own language. So the way in which English is kind of giving access to many of these texts, English probably is what is a common thread to the different texts that we've been discussing on this panel. I take this opportunity to thank all my panelists here. We've had, I think, a very, very interesting discussion. I'm sure you've had many occasions to talk about your translations, but I hope you will remember this one as somewhat different from many of the ones that you have been a part of. I also thank the audience for asking all the wonderful questions that you did, for being a part of this discussion, and thank you all once again.
Thank you, Nikhila, for coordinating this session and moderating it, and thank you, panelists.